On May 1, 1994, Italy's Imola circuit hosted one of the most tragic days in motorsport history. After a weekend marked by accidents, Ayrton Senna da Silva, a three-time Formula One world champion and a hero to a generation, lost his life after a violent crash at the Barrichello curve during the San Marino Grand Prix. The impact destroyed the car's suspension, launching the front wheel into the cockpit and plunging Brazil into mourning. The tragedy, broadcast live to millions, led to investigations, changes in safety regulations, and fueled conspiracy theories. This script reconstructs the events of that weekend, explores the causes of the collision, and discusses the driver's legacy. Without sensationalism, we aim to present facts based on reliable sources and honor the memory of the greatest idol in Brazilian sports. Chapter 1. The Path to 1994. From a very young age, Ayrton grew up in an environment where speed and engines were part of daily life. At age 4, he received a go-kart built by his father, and instead of a toy, it became a tool to master his reflexes and feel the limits of control. With every lap at the Interlagos track or on the empty avenues of his neighborhood, he developed an almost mystical relationship with the act of driving. It wasn't just about winning, but about fusing man and machine in a precise dance of braking, acceleration, and perfect lines. This obsession with detail became the trademark of Senna's career. When he arrived in Formula One in the early 1980s, he found a changing landscape. Turbo cars, with their brutal power, demanded millimeter-perfect precision, and smaller teams fought to challenge giants like McLaren, Ferrari, and Williams. In his first year, driving for a modest team, Ayrton experienced firsthand the difficulty of competing with inferior equipment. He faced frequent mechanical problems, improvised structures, and little trust from sponsors. Still, he amazed by placing the car among the fastest in practice sessions, competing for positions with established drivers. His combative attitude, a blend of courage and technical skill, caught the attention of engineers and team bosses. Rain, which terrified many, seemed to be his ally. On wet tracks, he saw invisible lines and maintained control when others aquaplaned. Commentators at the time said he drove on water. The young driver did not accept mediocre results. He spent hours in the garage with mechanics, asking about every component, analyzing data, and proposing adjustments. He questioned everything from tire pressure to wing aerodynamics. This perfectionism connected him to the science behind racing and made him understand that talent needs a well-balanced car. In historic races like the 1984 Monaco Grand Prix, when he drove an inferior car in a storm and nearly won, he showed the world that his key difference was mental. While others hesitated, he saw opportunities. Monaco, Silverstone, Spa, each circuit served as a laboratory to test limits. Senna saw Formula One as a complex puzzle where physics, mechanics, and psychology came together, and he wanted to master it. As he matured, he sought opportunities with bigger teams. The move to a traditional team with better resources brought a new phase. His aggressive yet elegant driving style found machines capable of translating his intentions into pure speed. His duels with formidable contemporaries, his millimeter-perfect overtakes, and his determination in qualifying sessions, always seeking pole position, made his races true spectacles. However, behind his invincible aura was a restless human who was not content with victories. He aspired to more than trophies. He wanted to transform the way of racing. He spent hours with engineers discussing new solutions, experimenting with components, and debating safety. He sought perfection and did not tolerate flaws, in himself or in the car. Therefore, when he accepted the challenge of driving for Williams in 1994, he knew he was leaving a winning team to join an ambitious project. Williams had achieved consecutive titles and promised a sophisticated chassis. However, the FIA had banned electronic aids like active suspension and traction control, making the cars difficult to drive. The new FW16 proved temperamental, with unstable aerodynamics and unpredictable behavior in high-speed corners. Ayrton, accustomed to trusting his equipment completely, felt the difference from the very first laps. He retired from the first two races of the championship and, despite his frustration, remained determined. His long meetings with engineers, his insistence on participating in the car's preparation, and his ability to motivate the team became even more intense. The season was long, and he believed that with hard work, the car would become competitive. Thus, the setting leading up to Imola was of a driver at the peak of his professional maturity, ready to face technical adversities and new rules in pursuit of a fourth world title. He was no longer the boy who dreamed on go-kart tracks, but the man who led an entire team with his vision. This chapter sets the stage for understanding the drama of that dark weekend. It is not just the story of a three-time champion, but of someone who reinvented himself with every challenge, willing to push limits in the name of his passion for speed and the incessant pursuit of perfection. Chapter 2. The Dark Weekend Begins. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix became known as the Dark Weekend. On Friday, April 29th, the Brazilian Rubens Barrichello, then a Jordan driver, suffered a severe crash during practice. The young driver lost control of the car, went airborne over the curb at Variante Bassa, and violently hit a tire barrier. Barrichello was treated at the medical center and suffered only scrapes and a broken nose. Senna was deeply shaken and visited his compatriot at the hospital, a gesture of concern that showed his sense of responsibility towards his colleagues. On Saturday, April 30th, during qualifying, the tragedy deepened. Austrian Roland Ratzenberger, a driver for the small Simtech team, was trying to qualify for his second Formula One race. On a fast lap, his car's front wing detached at the Villeneuve curve. Without aerodynamic load, the car went straight and crashed violently into the wall. His death was confirmed on the same day. Ratzenberger, 33, became the first driver to die during a Grand Prix weekend in 8 years. For Senna, who watched the rescue, it was a shock. He took a safety car to the accident site and reportedly told medical director Sid Watkins that he was considering not racing. However, he felt he had to continue and decided to honor his colleague by carrying a small Austrian flag in his cockpit. After this shock, the Imola paddock seemed paralyzed. Mechanics spoke in low voices, engineers stared into space, and the trucks and motorhomes resembled silent temples. Senna returned to his motorhome with a lost look and commented to close friends that he had never witnessed death before his eyes. The space that normally held laughter and strategy turned into a place of reflection. He, who had always controlled his emotions, now struggled against the weight of seeing a colleague succumb. Sid Watkins, a longtime doctor and friend, later said he advised him not to race. He suggested they leave, go fishing, and take care of their lives. Senna, however, felt responsible for his team and for millions of fans. To abandon the race seemed to him a desertion. In the garages, colleagues hugged and discussed safety. Many young drivers like Ratzenberger saw Formula One as a chance to achieve glory. The brutality of the accident was a reminder that the dream came at a high price. The Austrian's death broke a long streak without fatalities in the category. Since 1986, when Italian driver Elio De Angelis died during a test, no competitor had perished during a Grand Prix weekend. This interval created a sense of invulnerability among teams and fans. However, Ratzenberger's loss showed that the line between calculated risk and disaster was thin, and that there was still much to do in terms of safety. Before leaving the garages on Saturday, Senna met with engineers and teammates. He chose to participate in the race to honor Roland and to prevent the weekend from being marked only by mourning. Inside his cockpit, he placed a folded Austrian flag next to the gear lever, promising to wave it if he finished first. The gesture revealed his humanity and respect for his colleague. On Saturday night, he slept little. Accounts from those close to him say he woke up several times, thinking about the accident. He called his sister in Brazil, saying he was distressed, but that he couldn't abandon his team. Faced with uncertainty, he recited prayers and sought strength in the faith that had always accompanied him. Saturday was also marked by emergency meetings between team bosses and FIA representatives. They discussed the possibility of altering the track or reducing speed in some sections. Barrichello, already criticized by experienced drivers like Nelson Piquet and Gerhard Berger, was at the center of the conversations, but the short time and complex logistics prevented substantial changes. Teams chose to reinforce medical assistance and inspect their cars meticulously. Journalists in the paddock noted that the atmosphere was the heaviest they had ever witnessed. Assistants, mechanics, and directors walked with their heads down, aware that a shadow hung over the race. Despite the despondency, competitiveness did not wane. In the final qualifying session, Senna took pole position with a comfortable margin over his rivals. Even though he was shaken, he extracted the maximum from the unstable FW16, demonstrating admirable concentration. Upon getting out of the car, he pointed to the timing board and asked his engineer if Michael Schumacher had improved his time. This phrase expressed the contradiction of that moment. While mourning the death of a colleague, he remained obsessed with winning. This paradox, compassion and competitiveness, defined his personality and helps to understand why, even in the face of so much pain, he decided to line up on Sunday. Thus, Saturday in Imola ended with apprehension and hope conflicting, setting the stage for a Sunday that would go down in history. Chapter 3. Sunday, Chaotic Start and Safety Car. May 1st began with tension. On the formation lap, Senna lined up on pole position with Michael Schumacher alongside. When the lights went out, the start was chaotic. Benetton's J.J. Leto stalled on the grid due to a mechanical problem. Pedro Lamy, who started from 22nd in position, couldn't swerve in time and hit the back of Leto's car. Both escaped without injury, but debris from the impact hit the grandstand and injured 4 spectators. With cars and wreckage scattered, race control deployed the safety car for 5 laps. Sunday dawned with bright sun, and the paddock woke up early, but the brightness didn't dissipate the feeling of anxiety. In the minutes before the start, mechanics made final adjustments. Engineers studied data in the timing tower, and photographers circulated, looking for unusual images. Senna, concentrated, got into the car with meticulous movements. He checked the panel, adjusted his gloves, and received good wishes from Damon Hill and Gerhard Berger. Meanwhile, the announcer called out the drivers, and the Italian crowd cheered upon hearing the names of Ferrari. It was an environment of contained tension. Excitement for the race mixed with the heavy memory of the previous day's tragedies. When the red lights finally went out, the start was anything but orderly. J.J. Leto's Benetton on the second row simply stalled, creating a dangerous obstacle. Pedro Lamy came from the back row and, with reduced visibility, noticed the immobilized car too late. He collided with force, sending debris everywhere. Fragments of fiber and metal flew across the track, and some fell into the grandstand, injuring spectators. Images of loose wheels crossing the screen shocked families watching on television. Race control displayed yellow flags around the entire track and immediately called for the safety car to neutralize the race. At that time, the safety car was an adapted street vehicle, unable to maintain a pace similar to the 300 km/h of the single-seaters. For the drivers, forced to follow the safety car, each lap seemed endless. The racing tires, designed for high temperatures, cooled down quickly and became squared, making control difficult. Senna, paying close attention, made hand gestures and shouted on the radio, asking the race director to speed up. Schumacher agreed. Both knew that cold tires and cooled brakes increased the risk of losing grip when the race resumed. Accounts describe Senna shaking his head in disapproval, concerned about the slow pace imposed. As they drove slowly, engineers in the garages debated whether they should call their drivers in for an extra stop. It was a dilemma. Staying on the track meant losing tire temperature, but entering the pits and coming out behind the pack also represented strategic risks. Senna talked to his engineer David Brown via radio, trying to keep the tires warm with discreet zigzags. At the same time, he remembered the Austrian flag he had saved for the tribute. The safety car remained in front for 5 laps, allowing stewards to remove debris and assist the injured spectators. The crowd in the grandstands, which had been cheering minutes before, now watched in silence as the unusual scene of Formula One cars drove slowly in a single file. Finally, on the 6th lap, the safety car's lights went out. The drivers prepared for the restart. Senna led, with Schumacher glued to his rear wing, followed by Berger and Hill. The tension was palpable. The cold tires offered less grip, and the cars were heavier at the beginning of the race due to the fuel for long stints. Television commentators highlighted the importance of warming up the tires before the restart. Senna, with his sharp instinct, accelerated hard at the start of the straight, trying to pull away from Schumacher. This moment, in which the power of the engines echoed through the Imola valley, should have been just another battle. Instead, it became the prelude to the tragedy that would unfold. Spectators at home and at the circuit watched with apprehension. After all, they had already seen Barrichello get airborne on Friday and Ratzenberger lose his life on Saturday. Some described a different silence in the air, as if the public was aware that something else could still go wrong. In the pits, Team E members looked at each other, hoping the race would proceed without incident. But the combination of cold tires, a fast track, and a temperamental car was not ideal. Completing lap 6 and starting lap 7, Senna prepared for another pass through Barrichello. Fate, unfortunately, had other plans. The presence of a common safety car, Opel Vectra, forced the Formula One cars to drive at a slow pace. With tires and brakes cooling down, some drivers, like Senna, signaled for the vehicle to speed up. After 5 laps, the race resumed on lap 6. Senna maintained the lead, pursued by Schumacher. On the following lap, the 7th, still with cold tires and a car full of fuel, the blue number 2 FW16 headed towards the infamous Barrichello. Chapter 4. The Barrichello Curve and the Collision. Barrichello was a high-speed curve, a long left-hand section, taken at over 300 km/h, bordered by a small runoff area and a concrete wall. In previous years, other drivers had already had accidents there, Piquet in 1987 and Gerhard Berger in 1989, highlighting the lack of a safety zone. In the 1994 Grand Prix, there was still no chicane. The curve was taken at full throttle. On the second lap at race speed, Senna entered Barrichello at 309 km/h. Telemetry recovered from the car indicated that, upon sensing a problem, he braked hard, downshifted 2 gears, and still hit the wall at 211 km/h. The impact tore off the right front wheel and the car's wing. Another explanation pointed to by engineers considered aerodynamics. The FW16 was extremely low, and after the slow laps behind the safety car, the tires cooled and deflated slightly. This reduced the car's height by a few millimeters, causing the metal protection plate to touch the asphalt. The abrupt loss of downforce in the rear would have caused the rear to slide out. Senna counter-steered, but upon regaining grip, the front pointed towards the wall. The true cause was never definitively concluded. An Italian judicial report in 1995 attributed the accident to a steering column failure, but tests by Williams suggested it broke after the crash. Regardless of the cause, the consequences were devastating. Upon impact, one of the front suspension arms broke loose, went through the visor, and hit the driver's head just above his eyebrow, piercing about 2 centimeters. Additionally, the right wheel entered the cockpit and violently pushed the helmet against the headrest, causing multiple skull base fractures. The combination of these injuries led to a fatal trauma. The history of the Barrichello curve helps to understand why the accident was so serious. In 1987, Nelson Piquet hit that same wall hard and suffered ligament injuries. 2 years later, Gerhard Berger crashed in the same section when the suspension broke and his car caught fire. Thanks to the stewards, the Austrian got out with minor burns. These episodes drew attention to the lack of a runoff area. However, modifying the curve was complex. A river ran right behind the wall and the terrain was limited. Imola's original layout prioritized speed over safety, reflecting an era where risk was considered part of the spectacle. To understand the dynamics of the 1994 accident, one must remember that Senna had asked the team, weeks before, to adapt the steering column and bring the steering wheel closer to his chest. The mechanics cut the shaft and welded a narrower temporary extension, intended to last only 1 weekend. The part remained on the car during subsequent races. On the laps at Imola, vibrations and G-forces exerted enormous stress on the welded joint. Some analysts believe the weld broke before the impact, allowing the column to flex. Others argue that it only broke upon colliding with the wall. The truth is, there is no consensus. The improvisation of the part shows how, even at the highest levels of the sport, quick decisions can have unforeseen consequences. Telemetry recovered from the FW16 revealed the sequence of events at Barrichello. Upon entering the curve at over 300 km/h, Senna reduced speed when he felt something was wrong. The system recorded abrupt braking, downshifting, and an attempt to correct with the steering wheel before the car went straight. Physics explains that with cold tires and a reduced ride height, the floor can touch the asphalt, interrupting the airflow under the car and causing it to lose downforce. This causes an abrupt loss of grip. Combined with the possible steering failure, an impossible situation to correct is created. Even with extraordinary reflexes, Senna could not avoid the impact. After the crash, the world held its breath. Commentators shouted in the booths, not understanding what was happening. Spectators at home were silent. The image of the blue and white car stopped in the middle of the curve, with debris scattered and the driver's head motionless, became iconic. There was great confusion in the pit lane. Some thought he had lost consciousness and would soon get out of the car, while others feared the worst. The Barrichello curve, until then seen as a technical challenge, was transformed into a symbol of human and structural failure. The scenes of firefighters and doctors running, stewards waving red flags, and drivers slowing down are part of the collective memory of the sport. Chapter 5. The Rescue and the Fight for Life. After the impact, Senna remained motionless. Aerial images showed his head moving slightly to the left before returning and stopping, which generated a brief hope. Stewards and firefighters arrived at the scene, but they could not touch the driver until the medical team led by Professor Sid Watkins arrived. When Watkins opened the visor, he saw a severe wound on the temple and intense bleeding. He performed an emergency tracheotomy to ensure airflow and control blood loss. Around the track, reporters and cameras recorded every movement. The race director immediately displayed red flags to stop the race, and the cars were led to the pits, while helicopters flew over the area. Some fans prayed, others cried. There was a feeling of collective disbelief. Senna, lying on the ground, was surrounded by professionals who had known him for years. Many stewards and doctors had spent time with him at various tracks and were now fighting for his survival with dedication and respect. Time seemed to stretch for those watching. During the minutes before the helicopter took off, Professor Watkins kept his hand on Senna's shoulder, talking to him despite knowing the driver was unconscious. In later testimonies, he reported that he noticed a tear rolling down his friend's face, as if he were aware of what was happening. The medical team placed a neck brace and immobilized his head with lateral supports. The paramedic responsible for the transport described in interviews that everyone was aware of the seriousness and that the helicopter's light structure seemed to tremble with the weight of the moment. At 2:30 p.m., the helicopter took off for Bologna. The journey of about 20 kilometers took just over 10 minutes. While the aircraft flew over the hills of Emilia-Romagna, Italian radio stations interrupted their broadcasts to report that Senna was being transferred in critical condition. In São Paulo, still early morning, family and friends began to receive alarming phone calls. Many Brazilians still didn't know about Ratzenberger's accident, which increased the shock upon waking up. Inside the helicopter, monitors showed unstable blood pressure. Doctors administered medications to contain cerebral edema. With each passing minute, the feeling of helplessness grew. The arrival at Maggiore Hospital mobilized a team of neurosurgeons. Conflicting information circulated. Some outlets said Senna had arrived conscious, others spoke of a deep coma. The protocol required quick assessments to check for possible surgical interventions. A CT scan revealed subarachnoid hemorrhage, brainstem injury, and extensive fractures. The team concluded there was no possibility of reversing the damage. Still, they tried to stabilize the patient with ventilatory support and medications. Outside, journalists waited and fans sang the theme of victory in a muffled chorus, not knowing if it was a farewell. Inside the circuit, the race, strangely, continued. Many drivers, including Berger, Hill, and Schumacher, did not know the seriousness of Senna's condition until after the final flag. Upon learning the outcome, several cried in the pits, hugging members of the Williams team. Technicians dismantled what was left of the FW-16 to hand over to the Italian authorities, and police sealed off parts as part of the investigations. The scene was surreal. While fans around the world followed the drama in real time, the wheel of life of the Formula One circus did not stop. This contrast between the fight for life and the continuity of the spectacle deeply marked those who were in Imola that day. Senna was removed from the cockpit and laid on the asphalt. Watkins reported that upon lifting his eyelids, he noticed from the size of his pupils that the driver had suffered massive brain damage. The medical team requested a helicopter and kept the Brazilian stable during the 43-minute flight to Maggiore Hospital in Bologna. During the journey, Senna's heart stopped around 3:10 p.m., but he was resuscitated. His brother Leonardo arranged for a priest to administer the last rites. At the hospital, a CT scan confirmed the diagnosis of severe traumatic brain injury. At 6:37 p.m., his heart stopped again, and the doctors decided not to resuscitate him. His death was officially announced at 6:40 p.m. However, Italian legal procedures require that deaths at sporting events be investigated. Therefore, the official report recorded the time of 2:17 p.m., the moment of impact, as brain death. The controversy over when Senna truly died generated ethical debates. Some professionals argue that the medical team kept him alive only to comply with formalities. Chapter 6. National Mourning and Funeral. In Brazil, the news shocked the country. Television stations interrupted their programming to broadcast bulletins about the idol's death. 3 days of official mourning were decreed. Senna's body was released on May 4th and flown to São Paulo on a Varig flight. The coffin traveled in the main cabin, accompanied by family and friends. Air Force fighter jets escorted the plane to Guarulhos Airport, where authorities, such as Governor Luiz Antonio Fleury Filho, received the entourage. A procession with 17 police motorcycles and a fire truck traveled 32 kilometers to the Palacio 9 de Julio at the Legislative Assembly, where the body was viewed by over 200,000 people. On May 5th, more than 1 million people followed the funeral procession through the streets of São Paulo, the largest procession in the city's history. The coffin was covered with the Brazilian flag and carried by fellow drivers and friends such as Alain Prost, Gerhard Berger, Rubens Barrichello, Damon Hill, and Emerson Fittipaldi. An artillery platoon fired a 21-gun salute, and 7 Brazilian Air Force planes flew in a diamond formation. Senna's gravestone in Morumbi Cemetery bears the inscription, "Nothing can separate me from the love of God," reflecting his faith. The announcement of his death shook Brazil like few other news stories in recent history. In the following hours, television stations interrupted soap operas and variety shows to broadcast emotional news flashes. Presenters cried on live television, and specialists tried to explain what had happened in Imola. In churches, people gathered spontaneously to pray. In the streets, fans wore T-shirts with the driver's face and lit candles. Senna was more than a sportsman. He represented the hope of a country facing economic difficulties and seeking pride. His passing created a collective void that united strangers in mourning. The transfer of the driver's body from Italy to Brazil was accompanied with solemnity. After the judicial release, the coffin was wrapped in Brazilian and Williams flags and escorted by a guard of honor to Bologna Airport. Even abroad, hundreds of Italians said goodbye with applause. On the Varig flight, family members occupied nearby seats. The hours of the journey were marked by silence and tears. Upon arriving in Guarulhos, there was a moment of emotion when the plane was greeted by Air Force jets that fired water salutes as a tribute. The world press reported every detail of the procession, highlighting the dimension of the Brazilian idol. The wake held at the Legislative Assembly of São Paulo had lines that stretched for kilometers. People of different ages and social classes waited for hours to spend a few seconds in front of the open coffin. Many knelt, made the sign of the cross, or sang parts of hymns. Anonymous people reported feeling as if they had lost a family member. Fellow drivers attended. Alain Prost, his rival in the 1980s, cried and consoled Senna's mother. Nigel Mansell and Jackie Stewart brought wreaths. President Itamar Franco decreed official mourning. and ministers interrupted their schedules to attend. The infrastructure had to be reinforced, with portable toilets and medical aid stations to serve the crowds. In the funeral procession, which left the assembly towards Morumbi Cemetery, it is estimated that more than 1 million people took to the streets. People climbed trees, poles, and rooftops to see the fire truck carrying the coffin pass by. Police motorcycles slowly cleared the way, and volunteers distributed water. In certain sections, the procession had to stop due to the crowd. At that moment, applause echoed in unison. Children wrote messages on posters thanking the idol for inspiring them. On the balconies of buildings, banners read, "Thank you, Senna." The atmosphere was one of sadness, but also of gratitude for everything the driver represented. The effect of Senna's death was not limited to Brazil. In European countries, newspapers ran the news on their front pages, and sports programs made space for tributes. In Tokyo, fans gathered in front of Honda's headquarters, remembering Senna's victories with Japanese engines. In London, artists and musicians dedicated songs. In the Formula One circus, teams made vows of silence and promised changes. To this day, Senna's funeral is remembered as one of the greatest acts of collective mourning in sports. It united millions of people around a shared sense of loss and highlighted the power an athlete can exert over a nation's identity. Chapter 7. Investigations and Trial. A few days after the accident, the FIA called a meeting to discuss emergency measures. The first actions included changes to pit lane procedures and the use of fuel, aiming to reduce immediate risks. In May, technical reports began to analyze what had happened. An Italian judicial document of 500 pages, concluded in February 1995, attributed the cause of the accident to the failure of the steering column, which had been modified at Senna's request. Members of the Williams team, including designer Adrian Newey and boss Patrick Head, were indicted for manslaughter, but were later acquitted due to the difficulty of proving that the part broke before the impact. Another line of investigation considered the aerodynamics and floor of the FW16. Tests by Williams and safety specialists suggested that the car may have taken off after touching the asphalt, losing downforce. As the reasoning of physics demonstrates, the car's proximity to the ground creates low pressure and generates downforce. But if the floor touches the asphalt, the airflow is interrupted, causing a loss of grip. Reports pointed out that the height of the cars should increase, and the diffusers, wings, and cockpit sides needed restrictions. Thus, although the altered steering column is a plausible explanation, the technical community never reached a definitive consensus. In accordance with Italian laws, any death at a sporting event triggers a criminal investigation. Thus, a few hours after the accident, the Bologna police seized the FW16 chassis, the Renault engine, the steering column, and the electronic control unit. Technicians disassembled the car piece by piece in search of faults. The images of police guarding the paddock, usually reserved for mechanics and sponsors, symbolized the seriousness of the case. Testimonies were collected from stewards, mechanics, engineers, and doctors, all describing the sequence of events from the start to the driver's removal. In December 1994, the Public Prosecutor's Office of Modena indicted Williams officials Frank Williams, Patrick Head, and Adrian Newey, as well as FIA representatives, for manslaughter. The central argument was that the steering column, modified at Senna's request, suffered from fatigue and broke, causing the accident. For the prosecution, the decision to weld a metal sleeve had been negligent. The defendants argued that the part broke on impact and that the loss of grip was the determining factor. The legal process dragged on for years, with detailed hearings, complex expert reports, and analyses by engineering specialists. In 1997, a first-instance court acquitted the defendants for lack of conclusive evidence. However, the prosecution appealed, and in 1999, the case was reopened. The Court of Appeals sentenced Patrick Head to 1 year in prison, a sentence later converted to a fine claiming indirect responsibility for the weld failure. Adrian Newey was acquitted, as it was understood that he had not participated in the modification of the column. Head's lawyers appealed to the Court of Cassation, equivalent to the Supreme Federal Court, which, in 2005, annulled the conviction and closed the case due to the statute of limitations. It was 11 years of litigation, highlighting the legal dilemma between assumed risk and technical responsibility. During the investigations, experts presented contradictory reports. Some stated that the column showed microfractures from fatigue before the crash. Others emphasized that the amount of deformation was not compatible with a prior fracture. There were debates about telemetry data, lab tests, and computer simulations. The Turin Institute of Mechanics produced a report indicating that the steering failure occurred fractions of a second before the impact. Renault and Williams, on the other hand, argued that the sensors recorded torque on the column until the moment of the collision, suggesting it was intact. This technical divergence prevented a definitive conclusion. For Formula One, the judicial process represented an unprecedented shock. For the first time, engineers and team bosses were in the dock for design decisions. This led the teams to strengthen their safety departments and document every modification in detail for civil liability purposes. The FIA created protocols to investigate accidents independently, including black boxes and additional sensors to monitor critical components. In the end, although no one was definitively convicted, the trial served as a warning. In motorsport, engineering decisions have legal and ethical implications that transcend the track. Chapter 8. Safety Reforms and Sporting Legacy, the Deaths of Senna and Ratzenberger led Formula One to revise its safety standards. At the Monaco Grand Prix, 2 weeks later, the first positions on the grid were left empty with the Brazilian and Austrian flags painted on the asphalt in tribute to the drivers. Retired champion Niki Lauda announced the reactivation of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, GPDA, with Michael Schumacher, Gerhard Berger, and Martin Brundle among the representatives. The goal was to pressure the FIA for rapid improvements. Several changes were introduced in 1994 and 1995. For the Spanish GP, they decreased the size of the diffusers and raised the ends of the front wing, reducing total downforce by about 15%. In Canada, the cars gained higher side protection, a longer cockpit, and reinforced suspension bars to prevent wheels from coming loose on impact. The minimum weight was increased, the engine capacity was limited to 3 liters, and the so-called airboxes were abolished to reduce power. Additionally, circuits received chicanes, larger runoff areas, and tire barriers. Barrichello was transformed into a slow sequence of turns. In the following years, devices like the Hans, head and neck support, and more recently the Halo, began to protect drivers significantly. These advances, although a result of a tragedy, saved countless lives and changed the concept of safety in the sport. In addition to the emergency changes, the safety review process became continuous. At post-race meetings in Monaco, the drivers presented a list of demands that included temporary chicanes on fast sections, reinforcement of barriers, and power reduction. The FIA, led by Max Mosley, established a working group to evaluate each circuit. This resulted in comprehensive reconfigurations. Spa-Francorchamps gained larger runoff areas, Hockenheim added chicanes, and Monza installed chicanes before the parabolica curves. Tamburello, a symbol of the tragedy, was transformed into a sequence of slow curves to prevent cars from hitting the wall at high speed. The cars also evolved dramatically. In 1995, teams adopted wider cockpits and custom-molded seats that better enveloped the drivers. Side protection bars were incorporated to prevent components from intruding into the cockpit. Wheels began to be secured by metal cables to minimize the risk of them coming loose in accidents. Fuel was stored in safety cells made of ballistic material, reducing explosions. By the 2000s, the design of the carbon fiber chassis evolved to absorb impacts progressively, dissipating energy before it reached the driver. These technical advances, tested in labs and simulations, made contemporary cars much safer. The role of the Drivers' Association was crucial in ensuring that these changes did not remain just on paper. Leaders like Niki Lauda, Michael Schumacher, and Damon Hill met regularly with the FIA to review accident reports and suggest improvements. The GPDA, reinvigorated, gained an active voice in decisions about circuits and regulations. There was initial resistance from some teams, fearful of losing competitiveness. but a collective consciousness prevailed. From 1997, the FIA introduced mandatory side impact tests and increased the height of the cockpits. In 2003, the hands device became mandatory, reducing the risk of cervical injuries by up to 60%. In 2018, the adoption of the halo, a titanium structure around the driver's head, proved decisive in saving lives in multiple incidents. Improvements also reached the circuits themselves. Energy-absorbing protection barriers, such as the SAFER system, were installed in fast curves. Abrasive asphalt replaced gravel in runoff areas to slow down cars without them rolling over. Quick driver extraction systems were standardized, and rescue teams underwent constant training. At the 2007 Canadian GP, Robert Kubica survived a 290 km/h accident thanks to these measures, demonstrating their success. Later events, such as Jules Bianchi's accident in 2014, showed the challenges remain, but also spurred more reforms, such as the revision of yellow flag rules. Over the years, Senna's legacy in terms of safety has been consolidated. Modern drivers compete on tracks that take into account margins of error and in cars that protect them in an unprecedented way. Although the risk never completely disappears, the sports culture has changed. Victory no longer justifies any sacrifice. The generations that grew up hearing stories of the three-time champion know that behind the epic battles, there is a responsibility to preserve lives. Thus, each start also becomes a tribute to the lessons learned in 1994. Chapter 9: Cultural Impact and Memory. Senna's death had consequences beyond the tracks. In Brazil, his figure became a symbol of overcoming adversity and national pride. The Brazilian national team dedicated their 1994 World Cup victory to the driver's memory. The song Tema da Vitória, Victory Theme, played during his wins, became an anthem. In São Paulo, a statue in Ibirapuera Park perpetuates his memory. Companies, streets, and institutions began to honor him, and his family created the Ayrton Senna Institute, dedicated to educational programs. Abroad, admiration remained. Drivers like Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, and Sebastian Vettel have stated that Senna was a fundamental inspiration. The film Senna, released in 2010, introduced his life to new generations. Ayrton Senna's cultural impact transcends the tracks. In Brazil, he became synonymous with excellence and perseverance. His image was featured in campaigns for popular brands, and his São Paulo accent was imitated in comedy shows. After the tragedy, schools and communities began to use his career as an example of discipline and determination. The government created sports awards with his name, and the Brazilian national football team, on the eve of the 1994 World Cup, declared they would play in his memory. The World Cup victory, with players displaying a banner that read "Senna, we accelerated together," reinforced the idea that the driver was part of the national imagination. To transform mourning into a legacy, Ayrton's sister, Viviane Senna, founded the Ayrton Senna Institute a few months after his death. The institution allocated resources from sponsors and the driver's image rights to educational programs. Thousands of children throughout Brazil benefited from literacy projects, teacher training, and sports practice in schools. The institute became a reference in public policies, collaborating with city halls and state governments. Thus, Senna's memory was not restricted to a cult, but materialized in investments in education and citizenship, a cause he himself had expressed in life. In the world of motorsport, Senna influenced generations. Brazilian drivers like Rubens Barrichello and Felipe Massa took the wheel inspired by his example. Foreign champions like Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel said they watched Senna's races as children and dreamed of imitating him. Phrases said by the three-time champion, such as, "If you are not going for a gap, you are no longer a racing driver," became mantras. His aggressive but respectful posture helped to define the standard of behavior for modern drivers. And his attention to physical preparation influenced the professionalization of athletic training in the sport. Senna's influence also reached the arts. Musicians composed songs in his honor, such as Pelados em Santos by Mamonas Assassinas and Superhomem by Jovan. Writers published biographies and fictional novels inspired by his life. Filmmakers produced documentaries and films, with Senna in 2010 being a highlight, which brought together unprecedented footage and emotional testimonials. The documentary won international awards and introduced the driver's story to a generation that didn't see him race. On social media, fans share photos, quotes, and memories, keeping him alive in the collective memory. Murals painted in favelas and on avenues show his smiling face next to the national flag. In addition to mass culture, Senna became a moral reference. In corporate lectures, his qualities, focus, teamwork, and persistence are studied as examples of leadership. The spirituality he showed, mentioning God and quoting the Bible in interviews, inspired many Brazilians to reconcile faith and sports. This facet reinforces the perception that the driver was complete, talented, competitive, supportive, and spiritually connected. Even urban projects were named in his honor, such as avenues, parks, and schools, reflecting the omnipresence of his name in Brazilian daily life. 3 decades after his death, Ayrton Senna remains a recurring figure in discussions about national identity. In bar conversations, his iconic victories are remembered, such as the one in Interlagos in 1991, when he drove with only 2 gears. At sporting events, his figure is often mentioned as an inspiration. When walking through Ibirapuera Park in São Paulo, young people stopped to take photos next to his statue. Erected with private funds and fan donations, the work is a place of pilgrimage every May 1st. Abroad, circuits name curves after him, and motorsport museums display helmets and racing suits he used. Senna's memory has been transformed into a myth, but a myth anchored in values, achievements, and causes that continue to resonate. Chapter 10. Myths, Theories, and the Truth. After the accident, conspiracy theories emerged. Photos of the damaged helmet showed a hole in the visor, fueling rumors of a gunshot. Experts analyzed the helmet and concluded that the supposed hole was a reflection or part of the ventilation system. There was no evidence of a bullet. Some people maintain that the suspension bar would not have pierced the helmet, but images and reports indicate that a piece of the suspension entered through the visor and hit Senna's forehead, while the wheel compressed his head against the headrest. There was no gun or sabotage. The incident was the result of mechanical failure and unsafe circuit conditions. Another debate involves the time of death. The autopsy recorded that the crash caused multiple skull base fractures and a ruptured temporal artery. Doctors present argued that the injury was incompatible with independent life. Still, Senna was kept on mechanical ventilation for hours to comply with Italian law. This delay fueled speculation, but the reality is that, clinically, the driver was already brain-dead at the circuit. In the realm of causes, versions vary between the steering column breaking, the loss of aerodynamic downforce, or a combination of factors. The Italian judicial investigation pointed to the broken welded bar, while studies by the Williams team contested this, suggesting that the part broke on impact. The fact is that the combination of an unstable car, improvised modifications, and a high-speed circuit with a limited runoff area created the perfect storm. The trial in 1997 acquitted the engineers for lack of definitive evidence. Among the most unusual theories is that Senna was hit by a sniper positioned in the trees near Barrichello. The speculation arose from a photograph of the helmet in which a shadow looked like a bullet hole. In the pre-internet era, the image spread in magazines and generated conjectures. Ballistics experts and helmet manufacturers analyzed the piece and confirmed that the supposed hole was a reflection or a ventilation opening. Furthermore, autopsy examinations found no projectile or wound consistent with a gunshot. The sniper theory, although sensationalist, found an echo in those who would not accept technical explanations for the tragedy. Another recurring hypothesis suggests that Michael Schumacher's Benetton had tampered with the car with illegal devices and contributed to the accident. This narrative is based on Schumacher's dominance in the first races of 1994 and accusations of using traction control. However, there is no evidence of a link between the alleged fraud and the Williams steering failure. FIA investigations into irregularities in Benetton's software resulted in fines, but did not point to involvement in Senna's accident. The rivalry between the drivers fueled suspicion, but the official conclusions are clear in separating the issues. There are also those who say that Senna was depressed and deliberately accelerated towards the wall. Friends and family vehemently refute this insinuation. Senna was competitive and motivated to win with Williams, even though the car was unstable. After Ratzenberger's death, he considered not racing, but decided to line up to honor the Austrian. On Sunday, he showed focus and speed. He never expressed a desire to give up on life. The mix of sadness and the will to win is part of human complexity, but it does not support the idea of a voluntary act. The persistence of these theories reveals a trait of human nature, the need to find extraordinary explanations for traumatic events. When a public figure dies, stories often emerge that defy logic and fuel mystery. In Senna's case, the aura of invulnerability built throughout his career and the shock of the tragedy created fertile ground for speculation. However, detailed analyses by engineers, doctors, and independent bodies point to mechanical and circumstantial causes. Accepting the truth requires understanding that even the best are subject to unforeseen events. In concluding the chapter on theories, it's important to remember that questioning is part of the search for understanding. However, respect for the evidence is fundamental. Senna's legacy does not depend on conspiracy versions. It is founded on his dedication on the tracks, his sportsmanship, and the inspiration he provided to millions. By focusing on the truths, we honor his memory with dignity. Ayrton Senna's death was a turning point. By exposing the vulnerability of drivers, it accelerated the safety revolution in Formula One and triggered a global debate on ethics and responsibility in sports. It also showed the strength of a nation, united around a hero. 30 years later, the image of the driver smiling on the podium, his determination in the cockpit, and the green and yellow flag waving remain alive. As we conclude this video, we invite you to reflect on Senna's legacy. His pursuit of excellence, his respect for his opponents, his unwavering faith, and his commitment to social causes. If this story moved you, please share the video, leave your comment, and participate in the discussion so that, together, we can keep the memory of Ayrton Senna alive and continue to push for safety and ethics in sports. Thank you for watching.